As the pandemic continues to take its toll, we'll talk to one of America's leading science pioneers, plus what's behind the alarming rise in violence against Asian Americans. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. As a scientist and businessman, William Haseltine has created 10 different companies that have produced a range of products, from medicines to combat cancer, AIDS, lupus, and diabetes, to protections against bioterrorism. If that weren't enough, he founded Access Health International, a nonprofit think tank and foundation focused on expanding access to health care. He covers all of that and much more in his new autobiography, My Lifelong Fight Against Disease, from Polio and AIDS to COVID-19. Bill, welcome to the show. It's a remarkable book. I couldn't put it down. You were brought up in Southern California, as was I, but it was not an idyllic upbringing. I mean, you talk very candidly about your mother's mental health issues, kind of this disconnect with your father. You also had health issues. How do you think that shaped who you are today?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, compared to a lot of childhoods, mine was ideal, but ideal doesn't mean perfect. I grew up in a military base. My dad was a scientist, but they had troubles. And my mother in particular, from the time I was very young, had health problems. I still remember, and I think what set me on a path toward healing was watching her with septicemia, that is a red line of infection going up her arm, knowing and being told, I must have been 5, 6 years old, that if it reached her heart, she would die. And I was really angry, and it happened more than once. And I thought, that's not fair. Nobody should suffer like this person I really love. And then as I got older, there were other diseases that I and my family experienced that really gave me the motivation. I think every young person needs to find a purpose in life. Mine was to make sure that as many people as possible could lead full and healthy lives that weren't blighted by disease.
It's interesting because in your childhood growing up, you had these dreams of going to Harvard. You got there eventually, but the first stop along the way was the University of California at Berkeley, another great university. Describe yourself as a student.
Well, until I was in 4th grade, I was a miserable student. In fact, I remember my 4th grade teacher saying, you pass by the skin of your teeth. I thought, I don't have skin on my teeth. So she meant I barely passed. But then I discovered reading, and I discovered I didn't have to be in the complex family situation and life I was in. I could be anywhere. And I think that's what really saved me. And it turned out I wasn't stupid, although I performed as if I had been when I was younger, and I quickly rose to the top of my class. But it was reading and the ability to use my mind. And I think that's something that every young person should understand. A slow start does not mean a slow finish.
Speaking of reading, I'm going to read a passage from your book. Twice in my lifetime, the world has been traumatized by a common cold virus gone bad. First polio and now COVID-19. Both are cousins to viruses that cause the common cold. A little bit later on, you write as well, I vividly remember the terror of polio. Most of us think of colds as not a big deal, and yet these cousins, that's a whole other story, isn't it?
Well, you know, if you really look at any virology textbook, the cold viruses always have a nasty tail. Some people get the cold and die. Some people get the cold and are permanently impaired. Now, it just depends what the ratio is. For COVID today, that ratio in most industrialized countries is about 1 in 200. About 1 in 200 people who get it don't die. About 80% of the people have a very mild cold. And then the rest, 20%, have some serious symptoms. But then the cold-causing coronaviruses are very rarely lethal. So there's a big range. Things people don't realize about polio is only about 1 in 2,000 people who got it died. And only about 1 in 200 people who got it became paralyzed. But it was scary. You know, what I see my grandchildren going through right now, we went through in the early 50s with polio. Only rather than the winter, it was the summer. Can't go to the pool, can't go to the theater. There's something else I want people to realize. I call for young people, science is a superpower. It allows one person or a few people to save the world. Jonas Salk, is one such person who changed everybody's life. Once John Enders, a man who I greatly admired and later used his laboratory, discovered the virus and Salk turned it into a vaccine, no more polio. Science is a superpower. And that's how young people who want to make a difference should think about it.
Science can change lives, so can conversations. You talk about this cold December day, a friend grabs you by the arm halfway down the corridor between two buildings. This is how you describe it. He says, Bill, there's a new type of cancer that might be transmitted from person to person. That's just up your alley. It's a type of skin cancer. No one was talking about AIDS or HIV. That conversation changed the direction of your life, changed your research. Talk to us about that kind of happenstance, kind of casual conversation and how profound it was.
Well, I think it was Alexander Fleming that said, chance favors the prepared mind. I had been studying this odd group of viruses that cause cancer in animals. And everybody for 30 years had been trying to see if they cause cancers or other disease in humans and couldn't do it. But I actually persisted. I was one of about 5 or 6 people around the world who kept persisting, kind of like that little ram trying to bust a hole in the dam. I kept working on these viruses. And there was something about that story that said, you know, this might be it. Maybe the kind of viruses we've been working on are causing this. And the more I looked at it, and the more my friends, this small group of us looked at it, the more it looked like it was going to be one of the viruses we worked with, and it turned out to be that. You could say I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time, or you could say I'd worked for 10 years trying to find this kind of virus because I thought they would exist, because I understood what they did in other kinds of animals other than humans. And that gave me a deep understanding of what HIV/AIDS was, allowed me to understand it would be a really big problem that needed not just scientists, needed a whole society approach. So I then started not only working like crazy around the clock in the laboratory, I started talking to congressmen, helping to create foundations like the American Foundation for AIDS Research, and worked with Princess Diana on her foundation, trying to destigmatize it, trying to work on a whole society approach, which is what you need when you're fighting a really serious disease.
So in your lifetime, you've seen the ravages of polio as a child, you've seen HIV and AIDS up close, now COVID. How do you compare them?
Well, there's one big difference with COVID from the others. They all take human lives. And in fact, HIV has taken many, many more lives than COVID has so far. But the biggest difference is the effect on our economy and all of our lives. No matter how much AIDS was ravaging the country, and to my memory, no matter how much polio was causing trouble, it never ground the economies to a halt. It never caused something that's almost like a depression that has caused us to spend at least 10 trillion, maybe $15 trillion to try to dig ourselves out of this hole. So that's the biggest difference. Biologically, we understand it. It's kind of like a nasty flu, a flu that's like 10 times more lethal than the flu. But from a societal point of view, it's much worse than that. And what people are experiencing today, the economic hardships, the schooling, all of that is really unique in my lifetime to this.
Earlier this week, the president marked the passing of 500,000 from COVID-19. Let's watch what he had to say.
That's more Americans who have died in 1 year in this pandemic than in World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. That's more lives lost to this virus than any other nation on earth. But as we acknowledge the scale of this mass death in America, we remember each person and the life they lived.
What's interesting, though, about COVID-19 versus HIV/AIDS or even polio, you didn't have a president of the United States kind of sowing doubts about the science behind this, kind of dismissing some of the things that we've been talking about, wearing masks, social distancing. How much do you think that contributed to some of the problems we're seeing today?
Well, first, if you'll permit me, I'll correct you a bit. We did have a president who minimized HIV/AIDS, and that was Ronald Reagan. They just didn't want it to exist. They didn't want to fund the research. They wished it out of existence. The CDC actually tried to attack me and my friends who said it was going to be a big heterosexual problem. They wanted it to be a problem of homosexual men and Africans or some other kind of problem. So we went through part of this. So we overcame it, but we went through it for a long time, like 4 years. So that is a similarity. But I would say that it's something that I find very distressing. This is a war between viral intelligence, what it can figure out through essentially machine-like intelligence, random mutation, versus our rationality. Can humans with our mind figure it out? Well, we think, yeah, vaccines are good, and that's really good. I like vaccines. But there's something even better, and that is controlling it through public health measures. If you really want to eradicate this disease, you can do it. 7 countries on this earth have already done it, save for occasional infections from overseas. Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Singapore, and most of all China had a raging epidemic. And basically today nobody has died. I think 1 or 2 people have died in the last 6 months in China. And yes, they get occasional infections that come in mostly from the outside. They control them. So this can be controlled. If we had taken, and actually at Harvard School of Public Health, we helped Chinese healthcare leaders after SARS learn what to do in case of a pandemic. And they applied the lessons they learned and that they learned from their own traditions. And they did it very well. And each country did it its own way. We did not have to have this. We could have put this to bed early on with less than, counting people in the hundreds or less. It's a tragedy that this has happened. And it's a tragedy of failure of imagination and implementing what we know works. And we still, to this very day, much to my great distress, aren't doing what's needed. We hope with the vaccines we can push this down to a low enough level where then we might then learn the lessons of other countries and try to eliminate it, not just control it, eliminate it. You can't control this thing. As long as it's around, it's going to come back and get you.
Yeah. Bill, we've got less than a minute, but I really want to ask you this question because I think it's important. You talk a lot about traveling the world and how that's kind of challenged how you see things and subtle changes in the way you view things. Why is it important to have different perspectives or listen to different perspectives? And what's the danger of not doing so?
Well, the biggest danger right now that I see, and I know I'm talking on a Chinese station, is the difference between China and America. I see us as far more similar than we are different. I see 2 wonderful countries. And I know I'm going to get a lot of pushback from saying that, but I have offices right now in Shanghai and Beijing, and I have worked with a lot of young Chinese people, and I see the problems in America, I see the problems in China. But I don't think, even though our systems are different, we have to disagree the way it seems that things are going today. And when you travel around the world, I'll tell you my first impression as I got out and traveled the world, I realized how privileged I was. If you traveled the world in the early 1960s, I went through places where I really, literally walked over dead and dying people in the streets and the train stations. I saw people starving to death. I saw masses of people poor. And the change in the world today is phenomenal. We're so much better off than we are. And we could be better off still. I'm still trying to do whatever I can do. That lesson I learned as a kid, I'm still trying to apply and use all my energy and knowledge to help people cope and eventually conquer COVID. I hope we do. I'm pretty sure we will. And let's hope it's sooner than later.
Well, Bill, thanks so much. It's a great read. Suggest everyone pick it up. Some great perspectives. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
When we come back, we'll turn to concerns over rising violence against Asian Americans. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. And California civic leaders in the San Francisco Bay Area are calling for unity after a spike of violent attacks against Asian and Asian American residents, many of them elderly. As Mark New reports, many citizens are not waiting for the government to act.
San Francisco, January 30th. 84-year-old Vicharatnapakdi dies after an attacker sprints toward him and knocks him to the pavement. The next day in Oakland's Chinatown, a 91-year-old man is shoved to the ground by an assailant who's now been charged with 3 different assaults on that very day.
I was just tired of seeing everything going on social media, the attacks against the elders, them getting hurt, the robberies. It's just disgusting to look at. And I'm just like, why is nothing happening?
We just sat out there for like 15 minutes and showed our presence over there.
Okay, nice.
Born and raised in Oakland's Chinatown, Jojo Ao launched a fundraiser to hire armed private security guards to patrol Chinatown and nearby areas. To her surprise, she met her goal of raising $25,000 in one day, raised the goal to $50,000 and met that too.
Honestly, I didn't know that it was going to spread like wildfire, and so many people were so concerned about it and wanted to do something but didn't know what. So, I'm glad that I did this because, the support that, the merchants, they even say they feel safer. Some of the shoppers here, they feel safer.
In 2020, Stop AAPI received more than 2,800 reports of hate incidents from Asian Americans. 8% of those were physical assaults. Women were harassed nearly 2.5 times more than men.
The Asian American community is really fearful and concerned at this moment from both the racism of last year and then the current spate of violence. We don't know if this year's street crimes were necessarily racially motivated, but the effect is similar. We're being traumatized.
Eddie Zhang spent more than 20 years in prison for home invasion and kidnapping, but became a model prisoner and now a community leader.
We are able to learn from each other.
With a number of the attacks committed by Black Americans, Zhang made it clear the worst thing to do is pit one race against another.
We also need to hold the system and government accountable for their failure to address white supremacy and systemic racism that continue to perpetuate anti-Blackness and anti-Asians and using us as wedges. Right now, our Asian brothers and sisters and our neighbors are going through some pain, and that the root causes of violence and crime is actually lack of resources.
The activists say rampant violent crime in their community has always been there, but now people are seeing on video the brutality of the acts and the vulnerability of the victims. Mark New, CGTN, Oakland, California.
Let's get right to our panel. Caden Mock heads 18 Million Rising, a group dedicated to organizing the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Rosalind Chow is an associate professor of sociology at Georgia State University. She's also co-author of The Myth of the Model Minority, Asian Americans Facing Racism. And Stanley Mark is a senior attorney with the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Stanley, why don't I start with you? Anybody watching that story feels like a gut punch. It's really difficult to watch. It's shocking. But what's also shocking is how tough it is to build a hate crime case. I was reading here this group that Mark referenced, Stop AAPI, says roughly 70% of the hate incidents are heinous and despicable, but not illegal. Why is it so hard to build these cases? What's behind that?
Well, I think first you have to separate what is a bias incident and a bias crime. And the crimes against Asians, although the rise, definitely, I think API, Stop the Hate, has shown that it's over 3,000 incidences of bias attacks against Asians. But not everything is classified as a crime. And it's hard because you have to establish that the motivation is substantially whole or part motivated by racial animus or some sort of discriminatory conduct that's protected for a class of people such as, Asians. Of course, there's religious categories as well, but without getting into that specifically for Asians, it would be, primarily a racial animus towards Asians. And you would have to establish that before it would be classified as a anti-Asian violence crime, a violent crime, or a bias incident.
It's interesting, Pew Research Center did a survey. They found 26% of the people they surveyed fear for their physical well-being. So it's not just necessarily attacks, it's that constant nagging fear, that you're looking over your shoulder type of thing. Talk to us about that aspect of this.
Well, that's true, but that's the impact of these types of bias incidents as well as crimes, violent crimes. And people are fearful at this point, given the current context of the attacks in New York and in Oakland. There have been attacks across the country as well. However, we have to keep in mind that we need to deal with the fear in more of a community-based type of approach, and working with other organizations and groups in our communities and also outside of the communities in solidarity with people who are promoting racial justice as well. And of course, there's the necessity to get our elected leaders and basically break the silence among organizations and groups that are not aware of this rise of hate crimes against Asians.
Caden, let me ask you about these numbers. Do you feel like they're accurate? Because I've been reading a lot about domestic violence, elder abuse. So this kind of falls right into that same category, that maybe it's underreported. People feel shame, or they're fearful to report it. I mean, how widespread do you think this really is?
Well, it's really hard to say. I mean, one of the things that we do know is that in Asian American communities, where folks are not necessarily fluent in English, they may be hesitant to report crimes. The other thing that is the case is 1 out of every 10 undocumented people in this country is Asian American, and people are concerned if they report crimes to the police that they may also be reported to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So finding ways to stay safe without the police is really important to our community, and also may play a major role in whether or not folks in our community are comfortable reporting these things.
And Rosalind, there may be something else at play here, and I think you write about that. A lot of people feel like Asian Americans have made it. You know, they don't really have these issues. They're doing really well. They're kind of, as you say, the model minority. How much of that is at play here?
Sure. So there is this constructed myth about Asian Americans, one being a homogenous group and doing really well in like income, wealth attainment, educational attainment. And the truth is that there are many different types. It's a very diverse group, and educational attainment ranges from all different types of situations and types of immigration and history. And so with a very select group that has received, certain East Asians especially have received a lot of attention in doing well in a particular historical moment. And it was used by segregationists. It was a political tool in the 1950s and 1960s to create this myth that despite inequity in the law, in legal segregation, that Asians could make it anyways. So it was a tool to use to shame other people of color in the United States and then create this myth, which the myth doesn't protect Asian Americans from the threat of violence, from systemic racism, from issues of xenophobia.
And of course, Rosalind, these words matter. Of course, the attacks spiking in 2020. We heard a lot of words coming from the former president and others here in Washington that were rather inflammatory. Were words weaponized in a sense? I mean, we're still seeing it under the Biden administration, but we saw kind of this churning of this as an issue in 2020.
Well, it's certainly used as a political tool to place blame for the virus, saying the origins or create conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus, and then really fueling the rhetoric that had been present, you know, pre-2016 during the election, to fear immigrants and especially those from Asia and China as a threat. And so that language absolutely matters, and we see that people took those words, and we see that increase in hate crimes. We see the actual call to violence and people enacting violence against Asians and Asian Americans in the United States because of this dangerous rhetoric.
Caden, some high-profile Asian Americans are drawing attention to this problem. One of them is the actor and activist Daniel Dae Kim. Let's listen.
This is about asking for unity to bring light to a human issue. You know, regardless of whether you think that, you know, it's an issue among Asian Americans, think about the fact that this is affecting our elderly people. Everyone has a mother and a father. And, you know, if you imagine your father, your grandfather, your uncle being violently attacked like this, it's something that is universal. And so we hope that by raising awareness for this in the Asian American community, we're actually unifying, people against this kind of crime.
Caden, do you think by framing it that way that you're going to connect with a lot more folks?
I think that it's really important that when people with a really big platform like Daniel Dae Kim speak out about something like this, they do so in partnership with the community. One thing that happened was when Daniel Dae Kim announced this, he offered $25,000 for tips to lead to the arrest of somebody, which has the unfortunate effect that it essentially kind of deputizes private citizens to start harassing their neighbors. One of the things that we were worried about in Oakland was that this would lead to folks just kind of like on the street becoming more suspicious about each other. And it kind of runs counter to what a lot of activist groups are calling for, which is a recognition that safety starts with us. We've seen actually in the past several weeks that a couple of stories about the police killings of Asian Americans here in the Bay and also in Pennsylvania of Angelo Quinto and Christian Hall have come to light that happened in December. And so it's clear that policing and this sort of like punitive justice system are not keeping us safer. And the real question I think we need to be asking is, what are the systems of safety that we need to put in place? And that's what a lot of our work is based in. Asking this harder question, which is, what are the systems that are going to make us safer? What are the motives for these kinds of acts of violence in the first place? Are they actually about racial hatred? Are they crimes of opportunity? What are the conditions that give rise to the kind of vulnerability that makes people see our elders as targets?
Stanley, we've got less than a minute. A lot of parents worry about their kids, but now we're seeing kids worried about their parents, their grandparents. Talk to us about what you're hearing.
Well, in terms of the COVID relationship to what has happened in our communities, I would say that a lot of times, particularly the elderly, they don't necessarily feel that by reporting to the police it'll change anything. But I think the younger people who are active recognize that in order to address this fear in the community and to protect their grandparents and their parents, it necessitates that they have to work with other groups of people. And I emphasize that there are a lot of other organizations that are working for racial justice. Yeah. And I think we need to build on that because it is a systemic problem. It's not going to go away. And it's for, we've seen anti-Asian violence periods.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.